I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. You may be feeling cramped and crowded. You may be feeling restless and bored. I know a place can cure what ails you, leave you refreshed, leave your mind restored. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. You never know what you might find there. You never know what the tide will bring. But I know you'll find peace of mind there. Something about it makes me want to sing. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the mighty Hudson, down by the river, that's where I want to be. Just make your way down to the water. That river will bring the world to your feet. Might be something washed down from the mountains or stretched right out from the ocean deep. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. Once we got careless about our river, let it fill up with pollution and trash. Now we're trying hard to protect it. Wanna make sure that our river will last. I'll meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the mighty Hudson, down by the river, that's where I want to be. Meet you down by the river, down by the river, down by the river, to see what we can see. Down by the river, by the Hudson River, down by the river, that's where I want to be. Down by the river, that's where I want to be. Down by the river, that's where I want to be. Down by the river, that's where I want to be.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Steve Stan. I'm the board president and one of the acting executive directors of the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. And I'd like to welcome you to the second in the webinar series celebrating the release of The Hudson, an illustrated guide to the living river, the third edition of a book that Clearwater has been putting out there through the Rutgers University Press, since 1996. Tonight's program is going to be focused on the history of the river. It's titled New Ways of Seeing, Panoramas of the Hudson River. And it will be, it's our pleasure to have Roger Panetta of Fordham University presenting the program tonight. Since there are quite a few of you out there, we cannot take questions live during the program itself, but we encourage you to go into chat or into the Q&A button, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And as you think of questions to ask Dr. Panetta, feel free to type them in there. And at the end of his presentation, we'll ask him those questions and have a little interchange then. The Hudson first appeared in 1996. It was the Hudson, the book. The Hudson River has been around a lot longer than that. It was a project that we put together to try and bring an interdisciplinary approach, or actually a multidisciplinary approach to study of the river. You can't really understand the Hudson by just looking at its ecology or just looking at its history. It all works together for a full understanding of why it's the river we see and love today. So in the book, there are chapters about ecology, about natural history, about human history, about environmental issues, all woven together between the two covers of the Hudson. The first edition appeared in 1996. Second edition appeared 10 years later in 2006. Many of the environmental issues, of course, have evolved over time. There are new ones that are coming to the fore, like climate change. We've added a chapter to climate change in the third edition. And that third edition will be available through Clearwater. We'll put the ordering information in chat if you're interested in ordering a copy from Clearwater. The big change in the book is that it is in color this time. Many of the, especially the pictures of Hudson River or the reproductions of Hudson River school art are really magnificent now, shown in color instead of in black and white. It's a great reason to pick up a copy. The co-authors of the book, besides myself, are Dr. Panetta, Brian Forrest, and Maya Nimisto. Now, our original thought in putting together this webinar series was to have the co-authors do the 4 presentations. Unfortunately, Maya could not participate. So we're very lucky to get one of the leading researchers on the river, Dr. David Strayer, an emeritus scientist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, to give the last presentation. And just as a reminder, after tonight's presentation, there are 2 more. Next week, you'll hear from Dr. Brian Forrest, a former educator on the Clearwater, and his talk is Tales and Tales, that is T-A-L-E-S and T-A-I-L-S, from school. And it'll be reflections on teaching about Hudson River fishes, not only what he's learned about them, but what they've taught him. That's next week's presentation. And on the 3rd of February, Dr. Strayer will give a talk entitled A Few Thoughts About Science and the Future of the Hudson River, sort of tying together some of the things that you're hearing about in these earlier presentations and thinking about how they're going to pertain to the Hudson's future. You know, a book like this doesn't come together just because of one person or even just the 4 co-authors. It takes a bunch of people working together to make it happen. And I'd like to thank many of them, in general, the scientists, the historians, and the other researchers whose work forms the foundation of the book, the designers, illustrators, photographers, collectors, and institutions who provided the art, the Rutgers staff and editors, along with many colleagues who contributed advice, review, and other assistance, colleagues at Clearwater, in our other jobs with the state and with Fordham, etc. And finally, the funders. This includes grant makers, especially the Hudson River Foundation, which provided a major grant to start the whole process off back in the early 1990s and continues to be very supportive. But also our Clearwater members who pay the salaries in large part of the staff that helped this along in its early days and continue to do so. So tonight's presentation is by, as I said, Dr. Roger Panetta, and it's I'm really looking forward to it. I've known Roger for a long time. He of course was, we worked together on this book for many years. He's a retired professor of history who taught at Fordham and curated Fordham's Hudson River digital collection, which is well worth a visit if you want to see some of the original source materials that he's put up on that site. He's done a lot of writing about the Hudson. He edited a book from the Fordham University Press, Westchester, the American Suburb, and another called Dutch New York, The Roots of Hudson Valley Culture. He's done work for the Historical Society of Rockland County, authoring a book about the Tappan Zee Bridge and the forging of the Rockland suburb. He's also done a work on Kingston, the IBM years. And he's currently working on The Inescapable Shadow, the history of the original Sing Sing cell block. and the Rise of the Prison Museum in America. He has a BA from Columbia, a master's in American history from Fordham, and his PhD is in American and Urban History from the City University of New York. He's a member of the New York Academy of History as well. But when I think of Roger, what I really think of is one of the things that he struggled with in the writing of the first edition. There are many histories of the Hudson River Valley, but there aren't many histories of the river itself. And just as it's difficult to separate ecology from natural history, from human history, from the issues that we face, it's very difficult to separate the Hudson River history from the general history of the valley itself. But for a book of this size, we needed to do that. And he did an excellent job. And I'm really happy to now turn things over to Dr. Panetta. Roger, you can share your screen and take it away.
Thank you, Steve. First, I want to thank Steve Stan, and I want to thank him for a 30-year friendship. He's been the abiding force, both for the book and no surprise, for the organization of this webinar. It's an intellectual friendship that I have cherished, and I think we've managed to mutual benefit to exchange both historical perspectives and scientific information, and I appreciate that. I especially appreciate the way in which it's broadened my base of understanding. Speaking of ways of understanding, what I'm interested tonight is ways of seeing. One of the things in history we've begun to appreciate is the way you frame a question, an issue, a piece of history is very important to our understanding. And I think much of the Hudson River's history has been shaped by visual objects, paintings, photographs, films, sketches, drawings, an abundant body of material that really can help us see in new and fresh ways. And in particular, and this is an example of the way in which the study of one subject like the Hudson River begins to draw you down deeper into the sort of depths of the knowledge of the river, panoramas. And panoramas, the connection between panoramas and the Hudson may not be obvious. The connection to ways of seeing may be more vivid and clear. But panoramas represent one of those pieces of the Hudson that are very, very, very important and open up to us new ways of seeing, and also ties the Hudson quite interestingly through the vision, through the vehicle of panoramas, to an emerging pattern of looking that appeared early on in the 19th century, if not the end of the 18th century. Ways of looking. I'm looking here at an example of a French artist's description and perception of the trick of the eye. This was a painting that appeared in a French theater at the end of the 18th century. And notice the way in which the eye is sort of transparent. And it raises questions and gives us an example of the preoccupation of the late 18th century and early 19th century with issues of seeing. And I've used this as a kind of metaphor for the whole presentation tonight. How and in what ways do panoramas help us see the river? And in what ways do they see the river in new and fresh eyes? This sort of subject of optics, of how we see, really suggests that the way we frame the river through visual encounters is very important, I believe, for our understanding of the river's history and its culture. In 1796, the panorama craze, and I use craze deliberately, people talk about the Rama craze, started in 1792 in Edinburgh. Robert Barker, a local illustrator and painter, depicted this corner of the city of Edinburgh in this oversized painting in which he's playing with all kinds of issues of depth and perception. Notice the painting begins in the left foreground with the roof of a building and takes you out, almost as if he's trying to insert you into that painting and into that setting to get you to see in different ways. He coined the word panorama, meaning an all view. And that word view is very, very important. How do I encompass this? And for the panoramists, one of the interesting questions for them is how does an artist capture on canvas an emerging city whose size and scope is really a challenge to the eye. And if we could think about that, it may help us understand the sort of lineage here. And that's what I'm really going through, the sort of history of the panorama, till we get to about 1846, and we see our first Hudson River panorama. Not only did the panorama itself become very popular, but it very quickly evolved into a form of entertainment. And you can see on the left of your screen, the panorama building, and just below the word panorama, you can see the word Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the panorama show that's on display this week at that Edinburgh Panorama. This building was built particularly to house the Edinburgh Panorama of Robert Barker. Notice there's an opening ceremony. It's the beginning of the season, and these shows changed. The example of the Jerusalem title also is an illustration of the kinds of topics panoramas liked and engaged with: histories of cities, historical places, historical sites, etc. This is what the interior of the panorama at Leicester Square looks like. And if you look at the top of the screen and the background of the screen, both the first level and the very top level, you can see the sky, and down below you can see the landscape. In the upper view, in the upper platform, you can see the City of London. You entered the panorama building from the stairway on the left. So you were in the dark and only allowed into, as you can see, particularly the top level and the bottom level, into the panorama itself through a corridor. And so you're in darkness. And then as you ascended the stairway, either the lower level or the upper level, the panorama opened before you. And this experience was thought of as just a new way of seeing. The panoramist is really trying to create a painted view of the panorama placed inside this building to enhance the experience of what you're seeing, to change the nature of that experience, to make you see with new eyes. And these are the kinds of views they were trying to capture. This is a view of the City of London, and it really is an example of what we were trying to do. You can see St. Paul's just to the left of center, and spread before you was all of the city with the bridges crossing the Thames, the busy commercial traffic, the Tower of London in the lower left of the center. All of this is an example of this thing that they're struggling with. How does one capture this enormous growing metropolis within one eye? How do we do that, particularly if we cannot get above that view? This is I just want to back up once. I also wanted to mention, to be curious to many of you to know, this is called the Rhinebeck Panorama because it was found folded in a barrel in, of all places, Rhinebeck, New York, and eventually made its way back to London. This is the Pavilion Coliseum in Regent's Park in London. And on the left of the screen, you can see the central axis of the panorama, the column, and you can see at the third level from the top, the people on the observation deck. If you take your eye all the way to the top, you can see that skeletal outline of a kind of shade that's letting the light in. So you're sitting in that window on the middle or third level there, looking out at the landscape, which is out before you of the City of London. And it's a 360-degree view. Now that's important because how does one capture 360 degrees of landscape or history? And here's how they did that. We're looking at the Tower of St. Paul's in the top slide, and just below it, you can see St. Paul's, and St. Paul's set into the City of London. And at the very bottom of this slide, there's a small shack. And if you take your eye back up to the top of the tower, the top of St. Paul's Cathedral, you'll notice that the shack is placed there. And from this point, the artist, Thomas Horner, and this is dated from about 1823, would sit there because this was the high ground that gave him the full perspective of all of London. And from that, he would do sketches, which inevitably would become the basis, the groundwork for a panorama. So look up at churches, see if they have any nestled structures like this, because somebody may be painting a panorama. Panoramas were placed in buildings, and I showed you the one in Edinburgh. And just so that you know, this also came to New York. It was an enormously popular fad, took on a great attraction, a great entertainment. And I want to say something about that. It really is on a continuum between education and entertainment. Is the objective here to educate you about the church, about a religious setting, about a battle, or is it to entertain you? The cost was about 25 cents to enter, but you can see New York City, as most cities in the world, most cosmopolitan centers, had a panorama building, and those buildings would rotate shows like the ones we're looking at in the previous slides. It's interesting to note, this is done by A.J. Davis, one of the leading Hudson Valley architects, importantly significant for many of the spectacular castles along the Hudson. So it's a tight fit of things. Public buildings in the city of New York, and New York has its own panorama building. This lasted well into the late 19th century. And this, I think, one of the most spectacular illustrations of that, this is the Mesdag panorama in Holland, near The Hague. And if it's centrally located, you'll see there's a kind of dark central space. And imagine you're ascending to that space from below the ground right underneath that. And as you ascend that space, open before you is this spectacular beach setting in which you get a sense, you can see the craft, the beach craft to the right, the water to the far right. And above you, you can see the roof, which is letting light in to create some sense of light on the setting. That's 360 degrees. All of this, except the material in the foreground, is painted. And panoramists needed great skill to do this. It was a multi-person task, took time, capital investment. But the foreground here is made up of natural objects to try to create the illusion that you're really on the beach. This is the one surviving panorama we have, and it's one of the sad commentaries on panoramas, which I'll talk about later, particularly of rivers in the United States, that they have not survived. Goethe, when he saw these, he talked about panoramas creating sea sickness, S-E-E, sea sickness. And it was thought of as successful if women swooned. Battles, another favorite topic, in which you could, of course, because of the scope of the landscape, the field, major battles were ideally suited for that. And it also suggests the ways in which the panorama really was tied to history. Think of it as an ideal way to display, a visual display of history. And that's something to hold on as we get deeper into this. One corollary to this would also begin to appear at the same time, and you can understand the connection now. That this is a bird's eye view of New York from the middle 19th century. We're looking in the harbor, looking at the island of Manhattan, Brooklyn to the far right. And this is an example of what artists were struggling with. How do you capture this enormous physical object, this monumental, and I want to use that word deliberately, this monumental landscape in one view? And one way to talk about that is by creating these bird's eye views. One of the difficulties is how do you get this view? And of course, this is also the era of hot air balloons. And they became popular mediums by which you could imagine, create, and create bird's eye views, extremely popular in the 19th century, particularly used by all cities to try to illustrate their growing magnificence. In 1829, there was a spectacular panorama created for in London, the Adelphi Panorama, and I want to apologize. Steve and I worked very hard to try to make these hot links work, and we discovered early this week that Zoom is not friendly to hot links. This is a hot linked panorama. What the Clearwater will do is post the links to these, but if you link on this panorama and it's hot linked to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the 1829 Adelphi Panorama, you will swing from your left to the right. And you see in front of you the city of London. At Lambeth and Southwark on the right side, you would see a whole cluster of factory buildings, the city of Westminster. You can see St. Paul's, Westminster to the left. And as we could, if we could swing to the right, we would come to additional bridges and to Richmond. This really illustrates, and I'm sorry I can't move it for you, the economic development of London. You can see all the traffic on the river, the heavy boat traffic, the barge traffic, and you can begin to see the smokestacks of industrial buildings. And recent researchers about the panoramas, and there are many of them that are in existence still in London. Visits to the Museum of the City of London will startle you at their richness and beauty. They really have become documents of imperial expansion, ways to document that. So one of the ways one reads this panorama is how does it show the economic development of London and the ways in which that economic development is connected to its imperial expansion. And we've begun to be more sensitive to that in the last 10 years. There's also an interesting connection I want to talk about here, Audubon's Birds of America, a remarkable piece of natural history, and a remarkable piece of work by Audubon himself. But they also help us illustrate and give us a kind of understanding of the panorama we will look at, the Wade panorama of 1846. Why? Audubon sketched these birds very carefully, meticulously, and he took those sketches, and in order to create a published work, he needed an engraver. And I'd like you to begin to think of Audubon's books as a three-step process. Audubon's sketches, the engraver, who is a very critical figure in the middle, he takes those sketches and etches them and creates plates, either wooden block or steel plates, which are true replicas or closely true replicas of the original sketch or painting he receives. He then completes that engraving and sends it to the third part of this tripartite, the printer. They all are critical players. And there's no doubt that the engraving and the creation of Audubon's Birds of America not only is a work of the artist, but as a work, an actual published work, continues to be remarkable. The interesting connection here is that the engraver for Audubon's Birds of America was Robert Havell. And as Robert Havell was commissioned by Audubon to do this and he got older, he brought his son, Robert Havell Jr., into that. And he becomes an important engraver. In 1838, he makes his way to New York, settles in Ossining, where he does several Hudson River paintings, including early on in 1844. And this is Robert Havell Jr. This is his painting of the perspective from the North River. And what you can see is it's a kind of panoramic painting. So we're gradually sliding toward the idea of creating panoramas of the river. We're looking at Lower Manhattan from the New Jersey shore. And it's a fairly wide, extensive panorama. It's colorized, and it really is a statement of what so many things, the smokestacks, the economic activity, the density of the population, and the detail of the work, particularly of the cityscape, is very illustrative of Robert Havell Jr.'s skill. The connections here get interestingly complicated and tight if we look more closely at some of these. This is a portrait of Robert Fulton, who spent the end of the 18th century in Paris, sort of searching for activity, a business. I think of Fulton not only simply as the birther of the steamboat, but really an early American entrepreneur. And he, remember, offered both the British and the French submarines, torpedoes, looking for ways to really establish himself as a successful businessman. He was ambitious, he was driven, and surprise, surprise, in 1803, he offered this panorama and to sketch for a panorama building to Paris. He wanted to create a panorama of Paris. So we have Fulton creating panoramas. Why? Because they're becoming the sort of field of activity, the center of activity for young men who are entrepreneurs, who think of them as frontiers of business. And so what we see here in his panorama, I'm sorry, this is a 1799 drawing of that 1803 proposal, that Fulton really plays with the ideas of panoramas. Somebody has described Fulton as an example of creative combustion. I love that term. He had another friend, and they crossed paths in Paris several times. And this was a gentleman from Kingston, New York, John van der Laan, a Dutch American who was in Paris in 1796. And he got panorama fever too. And he began to paint panoramas. And what's important to us is he comes from Kingston, New York. And he paints one of the early panoramas, the panorama of Versailles. And this is taken from, and again, I apologize, this was hot linked so I could show it to you, but we can't use the hot links via Zoom. What you can see in this is one half of the view. Back behind where you're sitting would be the other semicircle. And this is the panorama of Versailles. The lower black section is the floor in the panorama. So you would walk on that darkened floor, and then the white illuminated strip is the actual painting of Van der Laan. And then above that is the roof. So it gives you a very good feel for how panoramas operated. They sort of compressed your view, and they look for the horizon. These are works that are focused on the horizon. And I think this is a remarkable work. If you get to the Met, you should look at it. It'll give you a good feel for that. Another interesting way in which it's tied to the Hudson, for a long time, it was housed in the State House, the first New York State House in Kingston, New York, where Van der Laan, that was his home residence. So it does have some loose connections to the river, as does Fulton through his steamboat. There's an interesting transition here as we move closer to our Hudson River panorama, in the way in which painters began to embrace panoramic vision. And this was particularly important for Hudson River painters who were really trying to chronicle and demonstrate the scope of the landscape. And for the 19th century, the early 19th century, the Hudson River is one example of that. The Mississippi is the Mississippi Valley and the Hudson Valley. Here, we're looking at Mount Holyoke. This is a painting, the view from Mount Holyoke. And we're looking across, and to your right, you can see the highly civilized area in the landscape to the right. And on the mountain in the center, you can see the words in Hebrew for God, Shak. And there's an interesting tension in this work, which was completed in 1836, between the light on the side, where we have development and or civilization, and the darkness on the left, where we have nature. And that's reproduced in the sense in which there's a storm that's beginning to recede. So does this canvas move from right to left? Does it have movement? And are we meant to be carried and drawn through that? And just to let you know that Cole is in the midst of this, he's left his easel and his umbrella on the promontory, just on the other side of the oxbow. And you can see that in the lower right-hand corner. To the far left, we have an illustration of a broken tree stump and a broken tree, suggesting the power of nature. He wants you to think, what happened here? Can you hear this? How is the tree stump the equivalent of the American column? We don't have runes, but we have tree stumps. Does that give us a history, a pedigree? And another painting, I think, in the same school, and here you really get a sense of the effort to try to embrace the monumental. This is Frederick Church's 1857 Niagara. And I always think if you get in front of this painting and you have the chance to listen, you can hear it. It's meant to transport you. It really, I think, celebrates the grandeur and the expansion of the country. Critics have suggested that it really is also a foreboding of the Civil War, and it's filled with all kinds of psychic issues of purging, etc. But let's leave those for a different day. What I think is really, it's filled with the spiritual optimism and the power of the United States. How and why do artists want to embrace that? And how and why does that work its way into panoramas? And are panoramas textbooks of our history? Probably the most important panorama artist in American history is John Banvard, a New Yorker, extremely successful, a millionaire, probably showed his panorama to millions of people, both here in the United States and New York. And in New York City, there was he showed at the Panorama building I showed you earlier, he had his Mississippi panorama displayed for a long time. I want to talk something about this because this advertisement for the panorama, if we could look at it, 3 miles of canvas, fiction, 1,200 miles of length, fiction. The mouth of the Mississippi, of the Missouri River, to the city of New Orleans, yes, true. The largest picture ever exhibited by man? That's an interesting boast. Possible. What is its real size? And how can that help us understand this? It's 12 feet high, and the panorama, and just hold on to this number for a minute, was 1,300 feet long. I'll say that again, 12 feet high and 1,300 feet long. He claimed at some point it ran a half mile. So what he's advertising here is something very different. This is not a panorama building, but this is a panorama show in which he's going to take his rolling panorama or his moving panorama, and he's going to bring that to your city. And here we see him sketching on the Mississippi. Notice his gun to his right. And he really is a very young man when he first does this. He spent about 2 years creating the sketches for this panorama. But again, if you keep the size in mind, you'll appreciate what an enormous undertaking this is. This is painting on a kind of a magnificent, enormous scale, a monumental scale that we really need to appreciate. He also shares with others, particularly with Fulton, the sense in which he's an entrepreneur. And here's an illustration of it. And I'll explain why we have to look at this single poor illustration. The panorama was rolled across the front of the audience on a wooden frame, usually a framed open space, the panorama behind it. And the lower right and left, you could see the cranks that were used to turn the panorama, and there would be the scene in front of you. And so all those 1,300 feet would be on several rolls, and the rolls would change as they ran out, and then the next roll would begin. If you look at the top, you can see the hook and the line on which the panorama was hung, and so it could be rolled. Now, this is interesting because it creates a terrific sense of motion, so you feel like you're moving here. And there's been so much written, I won't overload you with this, about the connection between panoramas and cinema. You can see that. I think that's fairly obvious. This became so famous, and the competition was international among panoramists, that Banvard's reputation preceded him to London, in many ways, I think, the center of the panorama movement. And he's describing his panorama here to Queen Victoria. Now, by this time, by the 1840s and the 1850s, the moving panorama, a traveling panorama, Banvard would roll up his canvases and just ship them to the next destination. This is no longer simply confined to the panorama building, and we're now separating them, making them mobile. So he went from city to city to city. And here he is displaying his Mississippi panorama to Queen Victoria, who really complimented him and gave him a special gift for this. But a couple of things are interesting about this. Notice he's standing in front of the panorama with a pointer. Panoramas, moving panoramas, had impresarios, guides, people who could animate what you saw and give you a sense of being educated. The screen, in this case, look at the size of the screen relative to him, and you get a sense of the 12 feet that we were talking about. But this is a very good example of the way in which it's a form of public entertainment or education. The one surviving panorama that we do have, it's the only surviving major panorama, is the work of the monumental grandeur of the Mississippi Valley. This was done much later on, and it survived simply because we don't know why it survived. It had the fortune of a caretaking performer and artist, Joseph Egan. And I apologize again, because this is a hot linked slide, which would take you to the actual panorama. And you would see, this is the first slide on that. And you can then see the hooks on the top that would deal with the hanging panorama, which would then scroll before you. And so if you go to the Met and look up the Egan panorama, you will see this. Let me go back for a second, if I may. Notice the Aboriginal monuments, American archaeology. So it's not just selling the landscape, it's selling something different. That what Mississippi has is a prehistory. It has, and I'm sorry you can't see some of the work in the great grandeur of this, you can see sites that really suggest an ancient history, an archaeological history of the Mississippi. And the question is, why would you have a panorama with that? And what's the value of that? Well, in a country struggling to establish its reputation, in addition to appealing to the work of nature, the Hudson is a spectacular work of the hand of God, one can appeal to ancient histories. And by suggesting we have these aboriginal monuments, we have an archaeology, suggests we're an old people. We're not just the young people, and we don't have to feel inferior to the Europeans who are flaunting their ruins and their archaeology. Now, how do we transition from the moving panorama? And I want to stress the moving part of that. We started with panorama buildings, panoramas, panorama buildings, then the moving, traveling panorama, great size panorama, to the ways in which people began to sequence, and I think of this as the prerequisite for building the creation of Hudson River panoramas. People began to sequence a series of paintings. Here we're looking at the work of William Guy Wall, an Irish-born American artist, in which he made about 20 aquatint studies of the Hudson River in the Hudson River Valley. And he's packaged them in sets of 4, and they are sequential. And I'd ask you to think about how we move from the sequential to the continuous flow of the panorama, and how that then is sort of synonymous and has symmetry with the flow of the river. Wall traveled down the Hudson to make these. And so if you look at these 4, we're moving up the valley. Here we're near Fishkill. And now we're near Hudson. And the river is always in the central axis here. And here we're at West Point. If you begin to think of collecting those together, you start to have the idea of the panorama. Can I connect, 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 paintings of sequences of the Hudson and turn them into a continuous flowing with a single story? And that really is made inevitable by the steamboat. The steamboat and travel in the steamboat is really moving us through space and time. And I love this painting. The Bard brothers, James and John, did these steamboats commissioned by the owners, in which they really show us what a modern vessel it is. The way in which it cuts the water so cleanly and efficiently. Its wake is hardly visible. Its smoke dissipated in the sky. Its flag fully unfurled. It really is an example of modern engineering at its best. But it really challenges us because it enables us to look in new ways and to look in a different speed. What does it mean to pass along the river? Not walk through it, but pass through it. How does that change and create new expectations for some void to see? We also should remember that the context of the transportation revolution is the rise of the middle class. With a modest amount of affluence and time, they began to become travelers. And steamboat travel from New York City, which became scheduled with regular destinations along the Hudson, principally to Albany, really began to provide a catalyst and tickle the imagination about what one could see. And I would suggest to you, it really also says, how does one look? We should think of the of the decks of the steamboats as observation platforms. Remember, in the first panoramas, we were in those enclosed buildings, and we stood on an observation deck, and then the vista, the panorama itself, was open before us. In the moving panorama, we were in the audience, and it was displayed before us. And recent work on the panorama has really begun to think of the critical role that the observation deck plays. And what do people do on the observation deck? We saw in the case of Banvard, sometimes as a guide or a tour instructor. But here, the steamboat moving so quickly through, passengers sitting on that observation deck are really ripe, aren't they? And ripe for an education and for information about the river that they now go through. Indeed, you can almost hear crew members telling them hold on to that little guide you bought for $1.50. Or if you were nervous about that, and I'll explain why in a moment, you could choose to be in a passenger tow and much more comfortable, where the observation deck itself is the tow structure. So there is no machinery, no mechanism. This is all view. And how does that itself begin to invite, well, tell me what I'm seeing. I'm excited. And again, I'm moving very quickly through this. This business of the observation deck and the way in which the steamboat really begins to present new opportunities is critical to understanding that. And the connection to the steamboat is really specified, so interestingly, in the appendix to William Wade's Panorama. The panorama itself, which I will show you in a couple of minutes, has a 50-page text that he wrote. And he listed at the end as an appendix, and here's the specific connection between panorama and steamboat, certainly the Wade panorama, all the steamboats on the Hudson, beginning with the Clermont in 1807. And this goes on for 2 pages. But if you look at the footnotes below, they give you pause. First, asterisks marking numbers of the various steamboats there. And if you look at the list, you can see they have markings indicating something happened. What? Exploded her boiler in 1825, killed 3. Exploded her boiler in 1830, killing 11. And on and on and on, until the last one sunk in the Hudson River near Athens in April of 1845, with about 200 passengers on board. 20 to 30 were drowned. So steamboat travel really was a threat and dangerous. And both we loved, worshiped, and were excited by the speed, but we were also threatened and endangered by that. William Wade published this panorama with George Crooms in 1847. And this is the cover of the published version. What I mean by that is that there is a bound version, this is not what was sold on steamboats. I'll show you that in a minute. But this was the bound version that contained the 50-page appendix text. And that's sort of important because it gives you a clue to what Wade hoped we would see. And I'm always torn between reading that and then carrying that narrative into the visual, but trying to respect the autonomy of the panorama itself and its objective to get us to see. So here's the cover of the panorama book itself. And this is what the booklet looked like. You can see Wade, the artist, and Crooms, the engraver, listed at the top. And at the bottom, you'll see Durstanel, the New York publisher. So you have artist, engraver, and printer, 1847, and the Hudson River. And if you look slightly above the graphic, if you wanted the colored version, it would cost you $2. And if you wanted the plain version, $1.50. If you notice about halfway down the screen, you can see a crease in the document itself, in the panorama, and that's where it folded. So you have to imagine a 13-foot panorama, 4x6, folded to extend to 13 feet. And you can imagine the number of folds. In one moment, I'm going to show you and try to take you through this Hudson River panorama and give you a tour of the Hudson via the Wade panorama. But because, again, this was hot linked and I can't operate that, we're going to have to try different means in a second. The panorama craze really died out by the end of the 19th century. And at the beginning of the 20th century, particularly photographers now got into that. And we all know the passion for panoramic photographs. So we can see this idea, this impulse, this desire to be all embracing, takes on very different forms and operates in very different mediums. Here we have the panorama of the Hudson. This is a very important work. It's all photographs, and it was done essentially by Wallace Bruce. A lot of this panorama work and photographic work at the beginning of the 20th century was done in conjunction with the Hudson Fulton celebration of 1909. And so we have here the panorama, and I want to show you what this looks like. And I want you to hold on to these visions. These are the photographs, both sides. And again, that's a consistent pattern in all printed photographic panoramas and printed panoramas. to simultaneously take you to both sides. And here we have Lower Manhattan, Bowling Green you can see on the upper right, and Jersey City on the lower left, on the lower right, I'm sorry, Trinity Church. And that landscape, I'm going to show you the 1847 version of that in a minute. So again, as we moved up the river, we get an idea of the density of the city, and we also have an example of the ferry terminal on the at DeBrow Street, going with the ferries departing to New York, and that's the day line, the early day line. The last attempt at this, because the form has persisted and it has attracted artists and photographers, the idea of wanting to embrace all of the river. And this work by Greg Miller from 2009, which is on display at SUNY New Paltz, was a remarkable effort by this young photographer to capture in photographs the entire river from Albany to the harbor. And you get a sense, if you can look inside this weaving panorama, of the scope of the work. And I think it's both a challenge to the technique of the photographer, to his skill, but really it's an example of the eye to want to capture this. And like the Wade panorama we're going to look at in a moment, it really takes you through. And I love the way this was displayed at New Paltz, because it creates the sense of movement, of flow, and of action. And the panorama really does that. I'm premature with my thank you. What we're going to have to do now is just take a moment to reconnect us to the panorama itself. And I'm going to have to ask you to be patient with this, because we're using the website from the Internet Archive, and there are 4 digital versions of this panorama in different library websites. I've tried to take the one that will behave. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles. We can't flip it, but it's the one that I think might be the easiest for us to manage and for you to look at. And I also want to apologize because it does not flow, but it's in several panels, about 10 panels, which disrupts the sense of the flow. Okay, this would be New York City. Most of the case, the panorama, and certainly the Wade panoramas, began at Albany, but let's see if we can get a better look at this. And what we can see here, and I would like to just take you up to the top of this, the banner announcing the panorama. Here Wade and tells us a couple of things about it that's important. Oh, I'm sorry, jump back. One, it's drawn to a scale of 1 mile to 1 inch. Now, I want you to think about that, 1 mile to 1 inch. Why does he say that? He wants you to think of it as credible, to have a kind of scientific legitimacy. And this is where the tension exists between the panoramist as educator and entertainer. So how is he going to get you to believe that it's credible? And he tells you that again by saying to you that the view was taken from the middle of the river. And I'm curious, I wish I knew how he did that. Was he on a steamboat, in a smaller boat? And I know a recent attempt on my part to help the National Park Service with a tour on the railroad up the Hudson showed the impossibility of that task, given the speed with which the railroad was moving through the landscape. And here we have the beginning of the panorama. It includes Brooklyn and the East River, the Atlantic Dock, and you can see Red Hook, the emerging downtown Brooklyn. And most importantly, here's the South Ferry crossing to the east side of Manhattan. And this was the beginning of the creation of the Brooklyn suburb. And there's an equivalent here also to Hoboken. So these are the first ferry suburbs, among the first suburbs in the country. Castle Garden, now Battery Point, eventually would become later at the end of the 19th century an immigration center. The cluster of masts at South Street, and then the wonderful example of the compact nature of the emerging city. And Wade was very keen on you getting a sense of just how progressive the city was. This congestion, this tightly packed housing really suggests an emerging modern civilization. He was not insensitive to the way in which he wanted to show the Hudson as part of America's new history. And one of the ways he does that throughout the panorama is by clustering cities, and in the accompanying text, he frequently talks about the population, the kinds of businesses and activities that were housed there. And so he gives us some sense of that. City Hall, Trinity Church, St. Paul's Church, City Hall. And notice that by the time we get to 20th Street, we're beginning to hit the suburbs. Not too many smokestacks, but enough to begin to suggest the emerging industrial center. And very early over here, we can see the Elysian Fields. And that is, I'm sorry, a little bit up more, I apologize. The Elysian Fields, they served as one of the crossing points of escape for New Yorkers. And here we have the 3 ferries crossing. And so we're in the areas of Hoboken, we actually experience a second river suburb, a second ferry suburb from New Jersey. And I have to apologize here because you'll have to just be patient with me as we scroll this back to the next adjoining page. Okay. All right, now we have moved into the Bloomingdale's. I'm sorry, we've skipped too much here, too far. Okay, let's back up one. We've moved into the Bloomingdale section, and that section of Manhattan really is the beginning of the suburbs. And I want to just give you an idea of what that's like here. Sorry, patience. Okay. To give you an idea of what that was like in Bloomingdale, this is really the suburbs. So we're talking about the 70s and 80s. And there's a very interesting phenomena here that you can see, is the creation of a therapeutic landscape. Here's the orphan asylum, and just up the road, there's the lunatic asylum, both commanding vistas of the river. The landscape has been cleared, and we can see it really clustered amidst the houses of some very wealthy families. So what does the river do, and how does the river serve as a curative force? Why do New Yorkers place orphan asylums in Bloomingdale, in the early suburbs of the city, a distant away from the heart of the city, but with a view of the Manhattan itself? And again, I apologize, we can't turn this over, but we're looking across at the Palisades, and he was very keen about this. And this is a good example, a good moment for us to think about how he sketched these, to think of the challenge this represented for the artist. How do I display a 500-foot rock mass? First, how does the artist sketch it? And then how does Crooms, the engraver, deal with that and represent that? And if you see what you think are a lot of scratch marks, it's a very good illustration of what his technique was when he carved the plate from the sketch he looked at. He tended to use a knife to create deep cuts. And so you get a sense of that here. And if we go a little bit further up along the Palisades, we also can see in some cases where the Palisades was collapsing and was showing us examples of talus, which is rock that was falling from the top into the river itself. So that the presence of the Palisades, by the way, made this vista from here very popular, and therefore created enormous interest in the public's appreciation of the landscape. So the west side of Manhattan, and if you look at some of these names, and we'll see more in a minute, became very highly valued as places to locate homes. Notice both the way in which they're on the cusp of the hill and at the base of that hill at the river's edge. Here is an example of the end of Manhattan Island. It's specifically mentioned, sorry, and the Spite and Dival here, and back into Kingsbridge, and we're leaving Manhattan, the island, and across to Riverdale. Also notice that the large steamboat in the center, slightly to the right of the image, is named the Iron Witch, and he was very careful both to give them full size and to name them. We'll see more of that as we move along. Sawmills, and here again we have the passion for institutions. We've got a male institution and a female institution right alongside of the mills. So again, the river's edge really has a therapeutic quality. Notice the way in which farms and cleared lands are being displayed and created in the panorama. Here we can move back, and I'm sorry, I apologize to take you back a little bit. We're in Dobbs Ferry. We've moved out of New York. And again, here we have a cluster of interesting homes. George Schuyler and James Alexander Hamilton, side by side, Alexander Hamilton's middle son. And then we have Sunnyside, Washington Irving Sunnyside at the water's edge. We have the Paulding's Lyndhurst, not yet Lyndhurst, to the left of Sunnyside, and we have Hamilton's Nevis estate sitting somewhat up on the bluff. So you get a sense that there's a suburbanization not only of institutions, but of wealthy and upper middle class people. This is also on the other side, the ends of the Palisades, and the extension of the New York Erie Pier, the Piermont Pier, taking the railroad, the Erie railroad out into the Hudson, where barges would begin to tow those loaded railroad cars into New York City. And it created an enormous business of commercial traffic between this pier and other piers and Jersey and New York City. Again, we're in Tarrytown, and this is an interesting note. This is where Andre was taken. This panorama is filled with Andre incidents. And again, it's an example of how he wants you to feel deeply embedded in the panorama. Wade wants you to feel connected to it because it's connected to history. And so in order to do that, he labels every place Andre talked, walked, was captured, was executed, escaped or attempted to escape. All of those are marked. And it tells us the way in which the panorama really was attempting to create a history. And that history is an illustration of the deep desire to create the sense of a pedigree, that we have a history. We're not a new upstart. We're people who have a pedigree. Sleepy Hollow. And then we have one of the great institutions up the river, a term really originally applied to Sing Sing as it existed on Greenwich Street, roughly where the Whitney now exists. And that was thought of as the suburbs then in the late 18th century. And so the term up the river really meant to go up to Greenwich Street in 17th century, 18th century New York. But this is up the river, 1825. The Sing Sing State Prison is here, and it's a wonderful rendition of the facade of the building. It has a dock. That dock is very important. You can see it in the foreground because that's the link to the city. It has a female prison, which is the classical building slightly to the right of the prison on that bluff. And then to the left of the prison, you have Sing Sing or Ossining itself, a growing, burgeoning commercial hub. That concentration of buildings is Wade's signal that there's activity here. And again, I want to apologize to you for the way in which I'm stuck on the west line, the west side of the river, and I'm unable to give you a sense of the east because we just can't turn this. Okay, and then finally, as we move past Ossining, we come to Croton, and we can see the Croton River and Croton Point, which in the 19th century was Underhill's vineyard and grape vineyard. Tellers Point, initially termed Tellers Point, eventually became the Underhill Vineyard. And if you notice, it's very interesting. The Croton River is here. And if we look at here, Sing Sing and Croton Point, we can see a line, a descriptive line, saying that the line of the Croton River aqueduct, 45 miles in length to New York City, is 1 mile from the shore's edge. So they were desperate to get that fact in, but unable to tell us how to do that. Unable to illustrate that is what I meant to say. I'm sorry. Okay. And we're approaching the highlands here. And again, you can see the Planks Point, and notice the 40 and then Catskill, Peekskill rather 42. That again, the marking, the mileage marking was very important. That was one of the ways in which Wade suggested the veracity of the work, that it was carefully planned. And I love the decoration to sort of give you a sense of the natural environment. And here we're at the beginning of this section. Notice we see brick kilns, the beginning of the brick yards, lime kilns. Again, they're all on the river's edge. So we now have the intermix of suburban residences, hotels, landings, and extractive industries. And we're now coming into the horse race. And again, lest you forget, he wants to remind you once more of the importance of the revolution and to give his panorama a historic moment, a historic detail. And so he illustrates the chain across West Point from 1777. And we get a good sense of that here. But also I'd like you to take a look at the way in which Anthony's nose is displayed, how it's done as a work of art, and the challenge it represented for the artist and the engraver. And we can see here at West Point, the placement of the cannons. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun on this. Here we have the sharp turn at West Point. And what we can see is the way in which, again, the Highlands and the depiction of the Highlands is just so rich and wonderfully done in detail. And when I look at particularly this section at West Point, I'd ask you to think about and to compare visually the representation work of the artist, the engraver, and the printer here with the 1909 photographic panoramas, and how you react to both of those and what you feel about both of those. I'll take us to the end here in a minute. If you notice the deep crevices, the marks rather, that's where the panoramas were folded, and that's where you would now open each page as we got to a new site, and we move toward the conclusion of this. It's also important to see the way in which these last couple of illustrations really document Steve's talk the first night on the islands that pockmarked the upper Hudson, and you can see them quite vividly here, and the obstacles they represented to navigation and the way in which they determined the placement of lighthouses. And here we come to the end, we're approaching Albany here, and the islands in the river go more large and get more difficult and deeper. And I want to thank you. I hope you enjoyed this and you get to see the way in which the Wade and Kroon's panorama, which you can't see. We will post the website, the link, so that you can go back and enjoy it at your leisure. It was a pleasure to spend the evening with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roger. We did post the website, the URL for the website.
Thank you.
so that you can check it out yourself. And we do have some questions, so let me ask those. The first from an anonymous attendee is, did the panoramic craze ever fizzle out, or did it become more mainstream?
I would have to say in the panorama buildings, some of them persisted through the 19th century. The moving panoramas probably till about 1880, but probably and photography had a lot to do with this. Probably by the beginning of the 20th century, they had phased out. There are some examples of them in semblance of that. Everybody probably remembers those little viewfinders they had in which you click the disc and it tried to create the sense of the panoramic vision. I think of those as the poor legacy of a remarkable tradition. What's interesting about this, and particularly the Mississippi River as an object, is the challenge that the grandeur, the scope, the scale, the monumentality of the American landscape represented to artists, not simply painters, but to artists like panoramists. There's an ideal connection between the size of the landscape, nationalizing that landscape, and the panorama as a form to represent it.
We have another question, actually a question of access. Do you have a personal website that talks about your interests in history?
Could you say that again? I'm sorry, Steve, I was gulping some water.
We had a question about whether you have a personal website about history, that somebody asked about panettahistory.com or something like
Yes,
that. Do you
yeah.
have?
Yes, if you, some of the things I've done, some other work, you can find them listed there, and some links to some other projects, panettahistory.com.
Okay. We had a question that I guess wasn't clear to some of the viewers. The New Jersey side being upside down, and that if you were on a steamboat with the panorama, you could turn it to face the side that you were looking at. As Roger pointed out as he introduced the website, unfortunately, it doesn't allow you to flip it to put New Jersey or the west side of the Hudson in the proper orientation. So you have to sort of strain your neck a little bit to take a look at that. We had a question.
Steve, can I say something? Because it's an interesting comment. Steve and I struggled with this because in addition to the Internet Archive, which is the website we use for the presentation, the Digital Public Library of America also has one, which has a lot of bells and whistles, including the possibility of turning it over. I worked on that a couple of days, and I thought I would give the audience nausea. The bells and whistles are really not easily managed, and they're probably something you want to do at home, but I thought not in a public presentation. But the question really is going after the simultaneity of vision. What does it mean to move through the landscape when I have to look left and right? And I think they were concerned and preoccupied with that. You could turn the panorama over and you could see the Jersey side, even though you were standing on the east side of the vessel. So you could do that. The other theory was you're going to come back. And so it's a round trip. You're going to just use the other side of the panorama.
Okay. I had a question. I noticed and you pointed out that some of the larger steamboats had the names of the vessels on the side. Were the panoramas used for advertising? And something like this today, you would see advertisements splashed all over the booklet. Were they used in that fashion?
No, and I don't know why. That is an interesting comment. They were sold on board for $1.50 for the black and white, $2 for the color, and you could buy them. I remember the last couple of trips of the Circle Line, and it pained me when I would take my classes for the trip up to the Bear Mountain. They had a 2-page flyer that was their effort to provide a guide to the river. And I thought, Wade is turning over in his grave. This is so sad. And I thought there was some poetic justice when they closed because they had abrogated their responsibility to give us the river. I think what you can also see in the panorama is the sense in which that journey was a big deal. They wanted you to look very carefully, not just fly through it. And the steamboat presented that opportunity to get that all-embracing view. But we want to make sure you look carefully.
You know, quite a few years, maybe 3 decades ago now, Arthur Adams published a book, a Hudson River Guidebook, which was a mile point by mile point description of sites to be seen along the Hudson. I don't know that it's still in print. Did Fordham actually make that available, Roger? Do you know?
No, I think the Fordham copy may be out of print, but you're right to point to that. Arthur Adams, a sort of wonderful Hudson River historian. So if you had a mile indicator, you would be able to read his descriptions of those locations. It suggests a very interesting impulse that we just don't want people to go up the river. We want people to go up the river and see it, to see its aesthetics, its history, its science. It's the desire to really make it an experience that's enlightening. At the same time, it's entertainment. It's almost as if we have an anxiety that you'll only look, but you won't learn.
You know, I had an experience a number of years ago. If you've taken the train, there's one particular train going north on Amtrak, where Amtrak had guides on the car to explain what people were seeing along the river. And I was asked to provide some input to the script for this particular guide. And it's actually a tricky business because you're going along the river not a steamboat pace, but at 100 miles per hour.
Yes.
And the views go by so quickly in many cases that you have to be really on your toes and paying attention to catch a glimpse of
Yes.
those things that you would see in more leisurely fashion if you were going up the river in a boat.
And that's an interesting comment, because on the 19th century steamboat, you approached the object of the landscape and it slowly moved by you. So your head could follow it as it left you and then recenter and pick up the new landscape and follow that. So the movement of the boat was accompanied by the movement of the heads of the passengers, and they really could chronicle that, which really had a great simpatico with the way in which the panorama was designed. I think it's a remarkable piece of work by Wade and by Crooms to encapsulate, in a way true to the tradition of the panorama, to embrace an enormous history and to place it in a scale and size that we could put in our pocket. After all, they thought, Steve, you would take it home and you would share it with all those armchair travelers in your household.
We have one more question, then I think we should finish up. How is actually, maybe I'll double check here, but how is this is from Heidi and Roger. How is the view of the Hudson and the panorama of the past compared to the Hudson and the panorama of today? Are there notable changes?
There are two parts to that question. One of them is the physical representations of the panoramas, and Greg Miller's spectacular work, but even Wallace Bruce's 1900 work. Because the panoramas are at the horizon, they tend to flatten the view a little bit. And I have a feeling, just my aesthetic prejudice, that Wade's panorama really created a depth, remarkable depth in a two-dimension work that I don't feel frequently in the photographic panoramas. I think in some way, Wade had a more dynamic element. I think a trip on the river today would be less varied than I think the 1847 trip on the panorama. In some ways, the river has gotten more, what's the word I want? Sanitized. Some industry has disappeared. Some of the messes that he caught, some of the history has even escaped our recollection. So, and even the texture and the feel of that, I think, is really not quite there. And again, I want to confess that's my prejudice.
Okay. I'll close out with a couple of comments that have come in about other resources to understanding what you see along the river and interpreting it that may or may not be out of print. Actually, I think most of these are out of print. Clearwater actually did a version of Wade's panorama, his 1845 panorama. Unfortunately, they've long been out of print, and I recently saw one offered by a rare book dealer for over $100, which is pretty amazing. It costs more than what you could probably get an actual panorama for less than that. But it was it was an interesting reproduction of the panorama that had interpretation of different scenes on the back, as well as the reproduction of the panorama on the front. And Alan Goldhammer is pointing out that another guidebook to the river is the Illustrated Hudson River Pilot by Richard Wilkie. And again, we're not sure if that's still in print. I suspect it is not. The other source that I'll mention is the Hudson is, of course, a section of a waterways trail. I've forgotten the exact title, but they have a guidebook for folks who are paddling the river in terms of what resources are available, and also some interpretation of the sites you see along the river. So look up Hudson River Water Trail and guidebook or something like that, and I think you'll find that. We're gonna close out now because it is getting very late. There's one more question about the Croton Aqueduct being visible on other panoramas, but I don't know that it is. I think that the panorama was created before the other aqueducts like the Delaware and the Catskill Aqueduct were created, so it would have been just the Croton one. All right, we're going to end up now, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank Roger, of course, for presenting on the panoramas and on how we perceive the river. And I would encourage you to look up his writing in the Hudson, an illustrated guide to the living river. He wrote the 4 history chapters in that book. And keep an eye out for the other works that he has been producing about Hudson River history. So thank you very much, Roger. Thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week for Brian Forrest's talk about what he taught about fish and what he learned from teaching about fish. So, Roger, any last words?
Peace.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Good night.
Night.